For 2 years, Kyle begged Connor and me to go hunting with him. We always laughed it off. Neither of us had any interest in tracking wildlife, let alone killing it. Kyle was the kind of guy who actually knew how to survive. He could gut a deer, split wood, and sleep comfortably on the bare ground. Connor and I were the exact opposite. We liked the idea of a hunting trip, specifically the part where we sat around a fire drinking beer in the mountains, much more than the grueling reality. But late one November, Kyle finally wore us down. He promised the cold weather would keep the bugs away, and he knew a secluded, untouched spot in the backcountry. Driven entirely by the promise of mountain views and a cooler full of beer, we gave in. Connor went because he never turned down a good story. I went purely out of a severe case of FOMO. We loaded Kyle's truck before sunrise and headed into the mountains. During the drive, Kyle ran us through a makeshift Hunting 101 crash course, explaining gun safety, how to walk quietly, and how to spot deer trails. We parked at a pull-off near an old logging road and began the hike. Kyle claimed it was only a few miles. It felt like 10. By the time we reached our destination, my shoulders were raw and my legs were violently shaking. We set up camp near a small, rushing creek. Kyle did 90% of the work, while Connor and I stood around being entirely useless. But once night fell, the effort felt worth it. The woods were dead silent except for the crackle of the fire and the rush of the creek. We sat on logs, drinking and laughing about old high school memories. For a moment, I actually understood the appeal of the wilderness. Then, out of the absolute dark, a scream ripped through the trees. We froze. Kyle tilted his head, listening intently, while Connor let out a nervous laugh and joked that it sounded like a woman being murdered. Kyle tried to rationalize it, suggesting it was just a fox, since their cries can mimic human screams. I desperately wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew it didn't sound like an animal. Because it was far away, we managed to calm ourselves down and resume talking, though the relaxed mood was entirely gone. Every few seconds, we'd pause, straining our ears. 5 minutes later, the scream pierced the night again. This time, it was barely a football field away. The conversation died instantly. It was a single, long, agonizing shriek that cut off abruptly. Connor stood up, staring blindly into the blackness, and called out to ask if someone needed help. I snapped at him, telling him it was a stupid idea to yell into the dark. Kyle looked profoundly uncomfortable, a look I had never seen on his face. He muttered that if it were a real person, they would have answered. "Kill the fire," he ordered quietly. "Get in the tents." He didn't need to explain why. A blazing campfire was a massive neon sign indicating exactly where we were. We scrambled to douse the flames and retreated into our sleeping bags, keeping our rifles within arm's reach. I barely slept, my brain transforming every rustle of the wind into something sinister. When I finally woke up to a gray, freezing morning, I stepped outside to relieve myself and immediately noticed something was wrong. Our camp chairs were flipped over. One of the coolers had been shoved sideways. A grocery bag filled with snacks was torn open and dragged a few feet away. Worst of all, Kyle's backpack, which had been securely resting against a tree the night before, was lying in the middle of the fire ring. I called out for the guys. Kyle walked out, took one look at the mess, and confidently announced it was a bear. It made sense. We hadn't hung our food properly, and the camp smelled like a buffet. The strange part was that nothing was actually eaten or stolen, just rearranged. Still, I wanted a normal explanation badly enough that I didn't question it. Kyle suggested we pack up and move deeper into the woods, both to avoid the bear and to get closer to the hunting grounds. We spent most of the day tracking. Kyle split us up, but kept us within his line of sight, showing us how to watch the tree lines. By mid-afternoon, even Connor had stopped treating the trip like a game. There is a strange, quiet weight that settles over you when you sit alone in the woods with a rifle for hours. Late in the day, Kyle shot a buck. The sudden crack of his rifle echoed through the trees, followed by his shout for us to come over. Dragging the heavy carcass back to camp was pure misery. Once we arrived, Kyle began field dressing and skinning it. Connor pretended to be interested, but I could see his face paling. I felt physically sick. I grew up an animal lover, and the metallic smell of blood and the sheer brutality of the process made me turn away. Kyle, completely in his element, bagged the meat into the cooler and left a bloody mess off to the side of the camp that I actively avoided looking at. That night, we drank heavily. Part of it was to celebrate, but part of it was because Connor and I desperately needed to take the edge off. Kyle cooked some backstrap over the coals, and I have to admit, it tasted incredible. But just as the night was winding down, the scream returned. It was distant at first, echoing the terror of the previous night. The air immediately turned cold. No one mentioned foxes this time. No one laughed. Kyle stared blankly into the dark, while Connor whispered, "There's no way this is happening again." A few minutes later, the second scream shattered the silence. It was much closer, and it was moving directly toward us. The firelight created a barrier. We were trapped in a ring of light, perfectly visible to whatever was lurking in the absolute blackness beyond the trees. Kyle stood up, gripping his rifle. Attempting to mask his fear with a surge of alcohol-induced bravado, he chambered a round, fired a few warning shots into the air, and began screaming obscenities into the woods, trying to sound as intimidating as possible. Connor and I let out hysterical, nervous laughs, fueled by booze and sheer terror. Our laughter was instantly cut short. The next scream exploded from the brush, barely a few yards away, just past the edge of the firelight. Kyle stopped yelling immediately. The warning shots hadn't scared it off. If anything, they had drawn it right to us. We aggressively smothered the fire, plunging the campsite into near total darkness, illuminated only by a faint lunar glow. We threw ourselves into our tents. I lay paralyzed in my sleeping bag, staring at the fabric ceiling. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy, rapid footsteps sprinting in a wild circle around our tents. Scrape something dragged a hard object slowly along the side of my tent as it ran past. I buried my face in my hands, terrified to call out to the guys, knowing that any noise would pinpoint my exact location. Then, everything went dead silent. The stillness was suffocating. A full minute passed before a scream detonated right in the very center of our campsite. It was so incredibly loud, so violently raw, that it ceased to sound human. Connor shrieked from his tent. I yelled out in pure panic. A millisecond later, a deafening blast echoed through the camp as Kyle fired a shot directly through the roof of his own tent. The chaos of the gunshot was followed by the frantic sound of footsteps tearing away through the brush, fading further and further into the distance, until the woods returned to a heavy silence. Nobody moved for a long time. Eventually, Kyle shouted to check if we were alive. Connor answered in a fragile, shaking voice I had never heard him use before. "We're getting into one tent," Kyle ordered. "Right now." Connor and I scrambled across the dark campsite into Kyle's tent. The three of us sat huddled together for the rest of the night, rifles raised, flashlights sweeping the fabric, barely whispering a word. Every minor creak of the trees sent us into absolute silence. Eventually, exhaustion won, and we drifted into an uneasy sleep. At dawn, we emerged to find a few things knocked over and a crushed beer can, but nothing was destroyed. Without a single word about hunting, we packed our gear at lightning speed and began the long hike back to the truck. As the miles put distance between us and that valley, the terror slowly mutated into that bizarre, hysterical laughter people experience after surviving trauma. By the time we were driving down the highway, Connor was doing a frantic impression of Kyle shooting at the sky like a Tusken Raider from Star Wars, and even Kyle was laughing. We debated calling the sheriff, but ultimately decided against it. Kyle pointed out that if it were a real person in danger, they would have responded to our shouts or approached the fire. Connor figured it was a local lunatic messing with hunters, and I reasoned it might have been someone experiencing a severe mental health crisis or addiction episode trying to lure us into the dark. I got home that night completely drained, expecting to sleep for 12 hours. Instead, I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in a cold sweat from a horrific nightmare. In the dream, I was back in the clearing, entirely alone. Standing between the trees was a woman covered in blood, screaming desperately for help. She looked directly into my eyes, and the sheer agony in her gaze paralyzed me. I couldn't move toward her. I just stood there watching her scream until I jolted awake. I sat on the edge of my bed, breathing heavily in the dark, wondering if my subconscious was punishing me. What haunts me the most now isn't the fear of a monster or a lunatic. It's the unbearable thought that there really might have been a person out there, dying and desperate, and all we did was hide in the dark and fire bullets into the night. Double tap if your chest just tightened. Share this with someone who loves scary stories, and hit that follow button right now so you never miss another midnight nightmare.